This year, we're talking about imagination and creativity in science and education. And I want to welcome all of our visitors from other colleges and schools and departments across the university. And thanks to Patty Pirro, Crystal Acosta, and our webmaster, Mike Leiden, here in the School of Communication and Media, and especially Dean Dan Gerskis and his office here in the college for his support of the Creative Research Center, not just financially, but most importantly, giving me the gift of freedom to explore this huge terrain. I'm a biographer and a professor in the Department of Theater and Dance here in the College of the Arts. 10 years ago, I was given the initial mission to, quote, think outside the box. And I said I needed a box to think outside of. And perhaps because I wrote a biography of Thomas Edison, I was charged with inventing the Creative Research Center, which is completely virtual, except for once a year when we get together on an analog level to discuss the imagination in all of its iterations and interpretations. Every year we collaborate with a different sector of MSU, from media and communication to film studies, to performing arts, to science and math, to humanities, religion, and communication, film studies, justice studies, and entrepreneurialism. The Creative Research Center is open 24/7, and our staff is always there to assist you. That would be me. So that's it for the jokes. I first met Pablo Tinio when he came to Montclair State 4 years ago, and I bought his book, which I want to show you, The Psychology of Aesthetics and the Arts. And he signed it very eloquently to Neil Best Wishes, Pablo Tinio. And at that time, we decided, this shows you how sort of the metabolism of academia is kind of slow at times, but we said we have to work together someday. And now here we are on the stage of this beautiful presentation hall, getting ready to hear from this amazing array of thinkers and scholars from MSU and two special visitors from NYU and PACE. Pablo Tinio is Associate Professor, Department of Educational Foundations in the College of Education and Human Services here at MSU and Director of the Creativity and Aesthetics Lab. Pablo is the convener and the mastermind behind this event, and I'm going to give the podium over to him, and he will introduce our guests. And as we say in the performing arts, he will explain the run of show. So let's have applause for Pablo Tinio.
Thank you, Neil, for the introduction. I'm just going to set my my timer here. We're 8 minutes each, strict. So we're going to give a presentation each, and then the second half of the symposium we'll have a roundtable. And we'll take questions, comments from all of you. Don't be shy, all right? We like to talk about difficult things and strange things and whatever ideas you might have, that's welcome. But I wanted to say something about Neil when I first met him. So we're sitting in my office, and he was telling me about some of the things that he's written, and he mentioned that he wrote a book on Man Ray. And conversation continued, and at some point I stopped and I said, Man Ray. And I'm thinking, there's something odd here. And then I realized that on my shelf at home was a Man Ray book that Neil actually wrote. And I read that book years before we met. So the next time I saw him, I brought the book, and he signed my book more eloquently than I signed his. So that's how it started. So I'm going to start by just kind of setting the symposium in context and think about creativity, imagination broadly, and to kind of give my colleagues here some space to, maybe they want to touch on certain things that I say, and for you to also ask questions and comment on at the second half of the symposium. So creativity, what is creativity? There are many definitions of it, and some of my colleagues will provide their own definitions. The industry standard for creativity is to producing something that is new and useful, all right? So by new, we mean something that is, all the different words you can think of: unique, different, unusual, strange, innovative, groundbreaking, game-changing, paradigm-shifting. And I think that's the less controversial of the two parts of the definition. I think the more controversial part is the useful part, right? Because the question is, like, who decides whether something is useful or not? And the answer to that is you decide whether it's useful within your given context. So if a child comes up with a new way of, like an analogy in a classroom, and it helps the classroom move forward and understand something in a different way, that's useful within that context. But an outsider might not think it's useful because it's like, oh, it's just an analogy, simple analogy. So imagination also has a lot of different kind of connotations and a lot of words and ideas associated with it. To visualize, right, is to imagine. To daydream, to envision, conceive, to brainstorm is an important one. Conceptualize, and of course, to fantasize. Imagination is kind of odd in a way where it's something that is somewhat functional. So we like to think of, at least some of my colleagues agree, that you need some level of imagination to be creative, right? But at the same time, so that there is this productive type of imagination that my colleagues and I have been exploring over the past 2 years. It's imagination for some purpose, to achieve something, to achieve a goal. But imagination in itself is also fine, right? So daydreaming, what's the point of daydreaming? Well, it's the daydream, right? You don't have to, it doesn't have to make you good at something. It might, but imagination in itself is actually quite fine. So creativity and imagination are much desired. I think that's it's hard to argue against that. I've never met a parent who ever said, I wish that when my child grows up, she's very low on imagination or creativity, right? I've also never, I don't know if you've ever gone to a job interview and been told, I'm sorry, we can't hire you. We're looking for people who are just not creative. You're just too creative. So in many contexts, work, daily life, right, in school and education, creativity, imagination are both desired. The issue with it is that we kind of handle and deal with creativity and imagination in a kind of strange way. And the reason for that is, especially creativity, it's misunderstood. It's very much misunderstood. And this misunderstanding is actually holding us back, at least for me, from an educational perspective. It holds us back from supporting kids' imagination and sort of creative thinking and creative work and creative behavior. So common misconceptions. One, who's creative? So if I were to ask you who's creative, or I would ask a child, a student, who is creative, they'll probably come up with some pretty big ones, right? Steve Jobs is creative. Picasso is creative in the arts. Marie Curie is creative in science. Da Vinci, Einstein, like, you can't deny their creativity. But this kind of way of thinking about who is creative is what we call an eminence approach to creativity. It's famous people who are typically, we realize they're really creative when they've been dead for a long time. And I hate to say it that way, right? But that's the focus, and that's what people think about as far as who is creative. And that holds us back, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can sort of get around that in a minute or two. Second is, how is creativity expressed? And that's a kind of weird one as well, all right? A sort of big common misconception. Creativity comes from these very special moments, these aha moments. A sudden flash of insight, and then suddenly you solve a problem, right? And it's inspiration from a muse, and you can get to choose what muse we want to talk about. And it's a mystery. It's a mysterious process. And it's common to think of creativity as not being under our control, but we know that it is. It absolutely is. It's not necessarily a sudden insight most of the time, and occasionally, on rare occasions, it is, but typically there's precursors to that sort of creativity, whatever discovery or realization that we have. And then the last misconception that I'll mention is, can creativity be taught? And that's, I think, a big one. We're all in this setting, right? We're in academia, School of Higher Ed. A lot of us work in schools, primary, secondary levels. And there's that sort of mystery that is associated with creativity. And you think about it, it's like a lot of people would say, no, you can't teach it. It's like somebody's either born with it or not. Well, you can only teach it to an extent, right? Or you can only teach it, but they have to be receptive. And that really holds us back, this idea that it is the specialness of it. I'm a scientist, and my colleagues are too. It's not that mysterious. And what we've done over the years is the field of creativity research is that we've uncovered a whole lot of stuff, really useful things that we can use in the classroom and society in general. And with the strange thing about it, that research has not trickled into the places where it's needed most, like schools, for example. So we know that there's a range of creative expression. We know that it could be something, making a huge groundbreaking discovery that changes an entire field, but it could also be something that is very small. So for example, if I'm reading a book and I see a word used in a very kind of unique, strange way, and suddenly it's like things make sense to me more the more I keep reading because of that one word or phrase. That's creative for me. It's sort of personal creativity, right? So there's this full range. And we know that. We've tons of studies on this at this point. There's a lot of factors that promote or inhibit creativity, and we know a lot of these factors. Some of you will talk about it. We know that experience in a particular area helps with creativity. If some of you might have heard of the 10,000-hour rule or the 10-year rule, right? In order to become an expert at one particular thing, you need about 10,000 hours or 10 years doing just that one thing. If you have that expertise, the more likely you're actually going to be creative, right? We have ideas now, like scientifically backed ideas on how to nurture and teach creativity. And Baptiste and I have written a lot of sort of conceptual pieces on this. He's done a lot of research on this. And assessing creativity as well, which a few folks, my colleagues, will talk about. You can measure creativity. And that's the one thing. It's not that mysterious. One of the areas of research that I've been doing over the past, I would say, 5 years is looking at how creativity relates to aesthetics. Aesthetics is, of course, how we perceive something that has been creatively made, right? So I've been focusing with my colleagues on measuring people's responses to art. So the question is, how, as a perceiver of an artwork, are we able to kind of pick up on some of the creative things that the artist put into the artwork? So we've done research on this. I won't talk too much about it. Again, I just wanted to set the stage, but what we did was ask people after they've seen either an exhibition or a specific work of art, how they emotionally felt about it. Now, emotion is tied to creativity. We know that, right? Because it's very closely associated. So we had people look at artworks and have them report the emotion the dominant emotions that they experience as a result of looking at the artwork. And we had data that looks like this. It's not very kind of meaningful. It's kind of actually like scary. It's like, wow, it's a bunch of numbers. But what we did, we found a way to through mathematical sort of an algorithm to depict that visually. So we had this, and what we created was we mapped these numbers, the set of data, into a map, a sort of emotion heat map, and then based on the heat of it, it allows us to depict the primary and most dominant emotions that people experience as a result of engaging with a particular work of art or exhibition. And we did a bunch of research on this recently at the Whitney Museum, and we're doing some other studies on it now. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Anyway, are you okay? So we're going to move on. So that's the stage that I've set, all right? Now I'd like to actually, that's 8 minutes for me, so I'm done. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Joshua Aronson. He's Associate Professor of Applied Psychology at NYU Steinhardt School. He's the director of the Mindful Education Lab. Joshua's work seeks to understand, I just kind of stole this from the website, seeks to understand and remediate gaps in learning, standardized test performance, as well as being and well-being among culturally disadvantaged students. Joshua is one of two authors. He's actually, if you've heard of the stereotype threat, he's the man who came up with stereotype threat. One of the most cited papers, actually, in psychology. Some of his recent work is on growth mindsets, meditation, and mindfulness, but also broader interventions that change school culture and student character development with what he calls the four-dimensional curriculum. He's won a gazillion awards. I just bolded a few. Scientific Impact Award from the Society of Experimental Social Psychology, the Career Award, National Science Foundation, G. Stanley Hall Award, American Psychological Association. I can flip a page, all right? But he's also, I love this. He's ranked among the top 100 most influential education policy academics in the United States. So, Joshua Aronson.
Thank you. Well, I'm really honored to be here, and I'm a little surprised because I was never artistic in any sense of the word, especially in school. But that's what I ended up studying. I studied kids in school, and for the first part of my career, I studied how to make kids stupid. And one of the ways you make kids stupid is to make them fearful that their social identity will mark them as stupid in the eyes of others. And so I think about that work because we made the general point in our work that when a kid is scared, they won't do well on a standardized test. But that's a very fairly narrow point to make about fear. There are lots of ways to be smart. There are lots of ways to be successful. There's a lot of ways to be to exhibit intelligence in some form. How many of you have heard of Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences? So there's so many ways to be smart, and one of them is creative intelligence. Now, when you're in a place that puts kids in competition or allows them to where you're grading them on things, naturally there's going to be a little fear. And I think one of the things that I've seen in schools that I would like to change in schools is a lot of that fear is around art, music. So thinking back to my days as a musician in the 7th grade, what happens if you don't practice? They move you down. And so you could start on for the 3rd chair, and before you go to the 4th chair. I started out pretty good, but that fear spiral started. What scares people, children in particular, they will tend to avoid. So as I can remember my descent from the 2nd chair of the flute all the way down to the only person that was worse than me was somebody who had malformed lips of some kind. So they actually couldn't play the flute at all. So that's when I dropped out. That's a shame, because I think music and art ought to take up a greater amount of space in kids' life. I've seen the transformations when you let kids expose themselves. I don't know if you remember everything on Pablo's chart, but there are moral emotions that flow forth from us when we witness beauty. And I think those are therapeutic emotions. They make us better people. For example, when you feel the emotion of moral elevation, when you see something so beautiful you don't have words for it, and it actually makes you feel small, that's a good thing. That makes you want to do nice things for other people, in fact. That makes you want to do art of your own. And so when you see the potential for art and imagination to elevate children, and then you see the way that kids often get art in school, sort of squeezed between English and math, quickly, graded, hurriedly, you see a wasted potential. Music in particular is, I've witnessed the therapeutic value. How many of you play music? How many of you play music and it makes you feel something that nothing else can make you feel. So last year, I was traumatized, and I went to a bunch of different psychiatrists, and I took a bunch of different drugs, and I underwent a bunch of different therapies. And some of it worked a little bit, but none of it got to the sort of core of that trauma. I felt like picking up my old guitar and just sitting there and playing it and playing it and playing it. One of the things that I read during that time completely changed my mind about learning. It's a book called Guitar Zero. Have you ever seen that book? You know the book? It shows you that when people, and people still make this mistake, scientists make this mistake. If you don't show talent early, you can't learn a thing. Now, I know that the 10,000 hour rule sort of put a dent in that feeling, but I do think that talent, particularly in music, may actually miss some of the point of doing music. Music, every culture has it because every culture needed it. It's a form of communication. It's almost primal. To make music, for me, would just open my mind to the fact that it is the best healing. And I discovered talents that I never knew I had when I finally just sort of relaxed. And you know what the difference was? Between music being therapeutic and music just being something that I did, it was being evaluated on it. At age 56, I could sit in my living room and play the guitar, and I didn't have some dream of being in a rock and roll band sort of making me wonder if I'm good enough. I didn't have somebody grading my performance or even a teacher waiting for me to try to move my fingers in the right way. Now, in fact, I had YouTube, the perfect teacher. Any song you want, plug it in, you can be making music. Why I'm going on and on about this is because I see a couple of things. I study kids, Pablo can tell you, all the way from 4 years old to graduate school and beyond. And what I see in school, I see the beginnings of trouble for creativity, because kids are often graded on not only their artistic works, how much they try, how good the thing is, but even in the questions they ask. I was in a school not long ago, and a child asked a question, and the teacher said, "Are you sure you want to waste one of your 2 questions on that question?" And so the kid didn't ask any more questions. Question would have to be good. It couldn't just be curiosity. It has to be a good question. Siri says it's time to stop. Well, so I just want to finish by saying, when we leave kids alone to do art without grades, I think we get better artists. I'm writing a book now about leaving kids alone, essentially getting out of their way. And this is becoming a more popular idea. One of the reasons it's becoming popular among college professors is because our students seem very incapable of doing things that require a lot of creativity. And I think of them as the sort of worksheet students. They want to know, they want things laid out so that their job is to fill in the blanks or follow directions. And so last assignment I gave my students, I said, you don't have to follow any format. This is what I want to know. You tell me a story about X. And they'll say, well, how many pages? And I'll say, well, no more than 5. How many words? No more than 2,000. How many, what does the spacing have to be like? And I just go, God, what happened to you guys? I just want you to make an artistic, creative statement and dazzle me any way you can. And they're like, but show me the steps. And I worry about that because more and more problems aren't going to be laid out in multiple choice or fill-in-the-blank format. In fact, the real problems that we have require a greater amount of creativity and imagination, and you don't get that when you scare kids from their earliest days. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. Dr. Baptiste Barbeau is Assistant Professor of Quantitative Methods in the Department of Psychology at Pace University. He's also associated with the Pace Institute for Creativity. He's Associate Editor of Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts, and he's affiliated with Yale University Child Study Center. Baptiste's ultimate goal in his research is to develop age-appropriate interventions that support cognitive and psychosocial development of youth in the general community, as well as special needs youth. His recent research, funded by the Imagination Institute, have led to the development of a virtual reality-based intervention program that engage youth in unusual problem-solving, embodied perspective-taking, and unfamiliar experiences to trigger change in their cognitive and psychosocial development. Baptiste?
Sounds like something you got on a website.
I saw that.
All right, so today I wanted to take this opportunity to discuss some general misconception about the construct of creativity. So I'm pretty sure everybody here heard about the creativity crisis. Who did heard about the creativity crisis? Not that many. So in education, it's actually quite popular. And this is coming from a paper from the Newsweek that was published about 10 years ago. And here is what you could read on the first page, that for the first time, research shows that American creativity is declining, what went wrong, and how we can fix it. So it's pretty catchy, and often in the literature nowadays, we read that we have to save creativity in children and adolescents and boost creativity in the schools, and often bring that up. But in fact, the evidence are pretty thin. So I'm going to just deconstruct very quickly the study that initiated this paper. So basically, it's based on essentially the descriptive statistics of the norms of the test of creativity that is called the Torrance test of creative thinking. And they looked at the average number of responses that people were giving to a test across different years of norming the test, so 1966, 74, up to 2008. So looking at the result very quickly, it looks something like that. So you had fluency, which is really an ideational rate, like the amount of idea that someone can come up with in a given unit of time, and the originality of the answer. So first of all, the originality was not really impacted, as you can see here. It was mainly based on this fluency rate. But as you can see, the way the data is represented here is a little misleading, because first of all, the spacing between the years that are represented here is not equal. So we should fix that, right? So I did it just for this presentation, just for the fun of it. So that looks more something like that. But more importantly, looks like the scale on the left side is not really accurate. So if we put the full range of score that one can get to that creativity test, it looks more something like that, all right? And then if we account for the standard deviation, which was also provided, which is basically the distribution of individual differences around that mean, so you have basically 95% of the population that is distributed around these two main lines. So, of course, it's a little less catchy to present it like that than like that. My version should be perhaps a cover like this one. My point here is that, I let you judge whether there's a creativity crisis, but the point is that if we assume there is a creativity crisis, there's a decline in creativity, was this study really about creativity? So that's mainly what I wanted to bring next. So first, it assumed that creativity is a measurable entity as a unitary, homogeneous construct. Like we could do with self-esteem or quality of life. It's pretty unitary, right? It's pretty monolithic. Creativity is not something like that. Recently, Rossiter wrote this comment in American Psychologist that psychology, just as its standard practice in the physical science, needs to agree on an optimal standard measure of each major construct. So it's a very noble objective, and again, it's probably possible for some constructs, but likely not possible for creativity. One of the reasons it's not possible is that the term creativity encompasses a number of behaviors and aspects that cannot possibly be captured by a single measure. So a good model to represent this diversity of behavior and constructs is this componential model of creativity. The idea is that we are creative based on a number of factors that are involved. So there's some cognitive factors, of course, knowledge. We were talking about the 10 years rules and these kind of things. There's also some personality traits that are involved, openness to experience, the tendency to take risks, motivational dimensions, and of course, aspects of the environment, right? The environment has to enable creativity and also will judge the creative outputs. So all these factors come into play in the creative work, and I would say that sort of the optimal profile of resources, of these resources, might depend on the task at hand, right? So there are creative tasks that might require a lot of motivation, and some tasks that will require probably less motivation and more knowledge, and so the profile of resources is quite different. And we have all a certain profile of resources, which makes it more or less fit for certain creative tasks. So in other words, we have multiple potential for creativity, and this potential vary according to the task at hand. And then another component is that, of course, we have potential for creativity, but are we going to use this potential? Are we going to transform this potential into achievement? And that's another question that is rarely actually asked, even in research. So it's not surprising that in the literature, in the scientific study of creativity, the way to operationalize creativity is quite distinct. So for example, we have achievement measures, which are probably the most objective in the sense that we can ask people whether they have a number of creative accomplishments for the past year, for instance. But this is more objective outputs. And as we know, creativity also expresses itself in less, not necessarily some measurable outputs, not always. We could also ask people to simulate, like basically to do a painting or a musical composition, like so we put them in a setting where they will actually create something, but this is still an artificial environment, right? They're not spontaneously creating something. And most often, we will ask them, that's the way we do it most often, we'll measure some specific resources of the creative potential. So we could measure some aspects of their cognitive factors, such as divergent thinking, and I will expand on this in a minute. Or we could measure their personality traits and see whether they have sort of this potential for being creative based on these resources. So that brings me to the last point. There's, of course, no all-purpose creativity test. And often in the literature, since the 1950s, in particular and 60s, we often operationalize creativity with measure of divergent thinking, which is a cognitive process that is used to generate multiple solutions or ideas in response to a single problem. So it's more a generative aspect. So for example, you could have a number of incomplete cycles here, and you have 10 minutes to draw something that uses the cycle. And so, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is pretty banal, right? Like maybe a face or a sun, something along those lines. And here are a few examples of original answers from teenagers. And so how do we score that? Typically with the number of responses that are generated, so there's a quantitative aspect of ideation. And another factor that is very important is, of course, the originality of these answers. So all this is great, but what we need to keep in mind here is that when we measure divergent thinking, which is not creativity once again, with this kind of task, the performance typically is not very consistent across different tasks. So for example, if I give you parallel lines or a square, the performance usually is only correlated on the 0.50 range, which in practice means these tasks share about 25% commonality, and everything else is specific to the task. So that also reminds us that creativity doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? We need to express it in a given domain. And even in this micro ideation task, we tend to be very dependent on the nature of the task at hand. I had other examples, but I'm going to skip to that and just present maybe that slide, which is very important. In 2021, PISA, the OECD program that assess school competencies of 15 years old, has integrated creative thinking as part of the next wave of assessments. And I've been part of this development. But unfortunately, it seems that it's going to be becoming something very monolithic and unidimensional. So we can question like what kind of information we will learn when we know that country A is more or less creative than country B. That's probably not going to help very much this multidimensional conceptualization of creativity that is very important, especially in educational setting. So just to close it, I hope that the idea that the creativity crisis is probably mainly a measurement issue with a lot of marketing. You got this idea that creativity is not a unitary construct, but more multidimensional, very domain-specific. And therefore, when we measure creativity, it's very important to account for this multidimensionality and domain specificity and identify where, it's not who is creative, as you were illustrating with big case of creativity, but where one is the most creative and can express best its potential. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Baptiste. Okay, Julie Daly is the Associate Director of the Research Academy for University Learning at Montclair State University. She's currently a doctoral candidate at Old Dominion University, where her area of study is narratology, reader communities, and popular science fiction literature. Her research investigates the intersection of narrative reader theory and real reader experiences in reading popular genre and science fiction narratives. In her role as Associate Director of the Research Academy, Julie conducts faculty development workshops, fosters interdisciplinary collaborations, designs and facilitates events, and performs faculty consultations that all work towards fostering teacher excellence at Montclair State. Julie?
I want to thank you for inviting me to be here. It's pretty much an honor for me to be among these folks and to talk and meet with them. So what I do here, I just want to begin by saying, when I was an undergrad, I was told in my sophomore year as feedback from a faculty member, and her opinion really mattered to me. But on a project evaluation, she said I lacked creativity. So when I was invited to speak here, I was like, Bernice, look at me now. Okay. I am presenting on what it means to learn and assess creativity. Okay, so I'm going to focus a lot of what I present here very quickly on the work of Ken Bain, who was my mentor. And what I do here at Montclair State is I meet with faculty and I say, how can we engage students and how can we get them to learn deeply so that they're meeting learning outcomes and goals and objectives. And one thing we want to ask of students and of ourselves, how do we best understand the nature and progress of their learning? Like, what does that look like in the classroom? The one thing that we want to emphasize in courses, and that seems pretty obvious, and we don't always do, is have very clear learning objectives. And these are the tasks that were mentioned by my colleagues before, these real tasks and goals and aims that students know, can see, and can aim for. And along the way, there should be points that students meet where they're shown what they're doing and what they still need to do. So I'm going to focus my brief talk here on the feedback process, how we give feedback on learning. And I'm no expert on what it means to teach or assess creativity, but what I do know is what it means to foster an environment in the classroom where students are encouraged to experiment, take risks, receive feedback, and try again. And that is the feedback process, and that is a critical element of student assessment. All right, so we know so this little diagram up here is based on the work of John Hattie, and he did a meta-analysis of over 500 different studies involving 450,000 different effect sizes from 180,000 different studies on instructional ways students learn. Those include things like things we learn at school, things we learn at home, things we learn from specific teaching interventions, different curriculum designs, those sorts of things. The average effect size was 0.4 across all these different factors, all these different ways that students can learn. And out of 12 meta-analyses, just on feedback, the average effect size was 0.79. So almost twice the average effect of student achievement, and falling within the top 5 to 10 influences on student learning. So what that means is that feedback is super important. Students need to know what they're doing, how well they're doing, whether they're whether they're on target, they're meeting objectives, and they're gonna get there. So what kind of feedback students receive is very important too. So we know from all these different studies that students that receive feedback on specific tasks, how to do things effectively with cues and learning reinforcements are much more effective than feedback that gives just praise or rewards or punishments. Therefore, grades are not as effective as actual pointed feedback that pushes students towards meeting a goal. The value of feedback on student progress begins with what they know when they get into our classroom. So how do we assess what they bring to the classroom, and how do we value that and honor it and use it toward moving them toward the learning objectives we've clearly stated to them? So what we want to do is construct our classroom environments that provide fertile grounds where we can take what they know and use it. A lot of different, the work I'm basing this on here is Ambrose, and she suggests that we actually give students exams that they'll take at the end of the semester, at the beginning of the semester, so they know what they have to work toward, and we can assess what they already know and what they're using when they come in. Have them solve a problem or a question right at the first day, right at the beginning of the class, and work toward answering those problems throughout the rest of the class. So that's diagnosing what students bring to the classroom. And then I want to spend a little bit of time on failure. So I have a lot of discussions with faculty about what it means to teach using failure. And I think failure is a really kind of negative connotation, but it's what's in the literature. And it talks about establishing environments where students are allowed to take risks and maybe do really badly, get things wrong. But allowing that environment to take place and to use what students bring, let them get things wrong, and then putting it out there on the table, thinking about what they're thinking, and showing ways that we can address the problem, even when we begin on the wrong foot. So I want to talk to you about letting students struggle with an idea, letting them have multiple ways of practicing and trying out how to solve an issue or problem, and then giving them feedback that moves them more towards the resolution. I'm really out of time. I guess I did over-prepare here, but I want to spend just a minute on these things. So looking at feedback, this is based on all these different surveys that Hattie compiled. There are 7 main things that I'd like you to take away. And this is a pretty popular graphic in teaching and learning. And it talks about these 7 ways that we can give good feedback that helps move students towards the goals that we want them to achieve and that they want to achieve, where they can see the progress they've made. The first is that feedback is not advice. It's not praise. It's not an evaluation. It's not a grade. Often when students receive exams back or essays or tests, quizzes, the first thing they do is look for that grade. What did I get, right? But that doesn't tell them what they did. It doesn't say what I got wrong, what I did well, where I need to improve, what's working. So that's negative feedback. That is not effective in moving them toward learning. The second is students need to know that the classroom is a safe place to make mistakes. We need to set up environments where they're allowed to experiment and take risks. The feedback we get from students as teachers is just as powerful as the feedback we give students. So that's important to remember as well. Let them tell us, too, what's working and what's not. Students routinely only read as far as the grades, so we have to make sure to make them look for those points of feedback where we're telling them where they can improve, what they can do better, how to move to the next phase, the next stage. Effective feedback is timely, so we're telling them while they're learning, during the class, that this is what you're doing and this is what you keep working toward. Feedback later on isn't going to be as helpful or effective. So giving that timely feedback, which I know is tricky to do as a teacher. We ourselves don't always have time. But making sure it's there when they need it, that is good teaching. Peer feedback is not reliable, all right? So when you do peer review in your classes, sometimes it's wrong. So think very carefully about the peer feedback that you set up in your classrooms. And students need to have that target. Make sure they know what they're aiming for. So all of these things, and I'm going to skip over these, talking about traditional assessments and comparing them to what an authentic assessment is, real-world learning, and just talking about the goal of this gathering, which is thinking about how we assess creative learning. So Baptiste already went over a lot of different measures that we use in formal assessment of creativity. But a lot of it at the classroom level is really not any different than how we would assess any other sort of learning. We're looking at, is it task-oriented? Are there opportunities to try, receive feedback, try again? Will there be a grade? Are there defined criteria and standards? Do students know what you think creativity is? Do you have some sort of expectation that they understand what that is? So have we defined it in our domain, in the discipline, in our class, in culture, in society? And what is a creative person? What is the creative process? What is a creative environment or a creative product? And those are different things that we can measure and look and establish within the classroom to move students toward a better and more engaged learning environment. All right, that's it. I'm sorry I went over. Thank you so much.
Julie? All right. Ashwin Vaidya is Associate Professor at the Department of Mathematical Sciences and Department of Physics and Astronomy at Montclair State University. His research interests lie in the general area of complex systems. He's the director of the Complex Fluids Laboratory at Montclair State, where they conduct experiments as well as do theoretical work. He's also collaborating with MSU education researchers on issues surrounding math and science education, with a focus on making creativity a central theme of our curriculum. His other areas of research: nonlinear partial differential equations, hydrodynamic stability, non-Newtonian fluid mechanics, fluid structure interaction, experimental fluid mechanics. If you have any questions about those, ask him. Come on, thank you.
Right. I'm really panicking. 8 minutes and I have so much to tell you. Right. I'm really an amateur after hearing all these experts talk about creativity, so you can take everything I say with a grain of salt. Some years ago, my colleague and I, Mika Munikata from Mathematics Education, we did a survey on a student's perception of mathematics. And we wanted to know what students think about physics and mathematics. So as part of the survey, we asked them what disciplines they think is creative. And obviously, students, this was about, I think, 300 students from different disciplines in physics, mathematics, biology, chemistry, and so on. And students said music, dance, theater, the usual subjects, are highly creative. Mathematics, unfortunately, fell to the bottom of the list almost. Right? And this is extremely disappointing for us, so we decided we have to do something about it. Reconsider our teaching practices, reconsider what creativity really is, and the cards are sort of stacked against us. If you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, at least this is the version that we saw many years ago. The definition is the use of imagination or original ideas in the production of artistic work, right? Of course, math doesn't play any role here. So I have been thinking about what creativity means over the past few years. I cannot define it. I'm confused. The literature is vast. But as an educator, I've been thinking about, and as a mathematician, how can I see this? How can I explain this to my students? So I'll give you an informal way of looking at it through a mathematical lens. So this is especially poignant, I think, in light of all the discussions we're having on this campus about gen eds. So let's say a student takes a few courses. Each dot here represents a subject, an idea, a course, right? Over the years, you take more courses, more courses, more courses, right? You've collected this vast amount of information. More knowledge is good. The trouble is, this mode of learning, through this mode of learning, your understanding is linear. It's static, at least I'll get to why I'm saying this. And it's prone to decay over time. People forget, they close the textbook, right? Even if they have to move on and use a particular topic, very often they forget what they've learned in the previous course. So my contention is, and this is, I'm looking at it through the lens of a mathematical subject called complexity theory, a theory of networks. Learning has to be connected. Courses have to play with each other, right? So if I connect a couple of these courses, a couple of these subjects, if I increase the connectivity over time, what I end up with is strong connections. And connections allows us to make new meaning out of old ideas, right? It offers a robust way of learning, a way of remembering things, right? Because you found new meaning, you found your own meaning in something, not the teacher's meaning, right? And this sets the stage for creativity in the future. This is sort of an emergent way of learning. You may not understand it today, someday it may click. So I'm a big fan of this famous curricular theorist, William Dahl, and I love what he says about this emergence of creativity from complex flow of knowledge results in emergent structures. That is, creativity in the context of education should be thought of as a unique way to arrange information so as to make new meaning of old ideas. I was planning to go into this, but Pablo and Baptiste sort of already discussed this point. This is the famous Torrance test, but the idea here, the central idea behind the Torrance test, any question like this, right? What might this object be? There's diverse answers you can give, and here's some of my fancy sketches, right? Two parallel lines could form a bridge. You could have any of these various shapes. It took me 2 hours to do this. Creativity really resides in the various meanings that you attribute to a thing, right? So somebody, whoever's doing this, is making a connection, right? So the richness of the meaning that you attribute is really the connection that you're making to all your past experiences, right? It's not just a parallel line because you heard it before, but it's something related to your own experience. So my colleague and I came up with this, another way of thinking about this, the Lego model of creativity. Right, I love analogies. If you have a box of Lego with few connections, right? Look at the one on the left, right? All you can make is linear structures, right? It's predictable, it's boring, right? You're not going to get anything new out of it. And so is the second one. You have a few more connections that you can make. But when you have diversity of pieces in your box, and you have a variety of connections to offer, what emerges is something nonlinear. You cannot predict what will happen, but you will get a variety of shapes, right? That's guaranteed. So that's a nonlinear, divergent way of thinking. That's what our education system should be focusing on. So when kids pick up a textbook in mathematics, this goes for my 8th grader as well now, and she's seeing a math book and she gets frustrated. Because all she thinks of is abstraction, right? Testing, all the pressures of schooling. Math is difficult, right? But having gone through this, despite all of this, I still love math because this is not what I do, right? This is not the story of mathematics that I see. This is not the story of mathematics I want to tell others. So, story of math starts with the question, what if? Right? What are the possibilities of a mathematical idea? Not what something is that's already defined, predefined. So, if you look at sort of the 19th century mathematicians, Russian mathematicians, Polish mathematicians, asked this question, what if you do geometry, not on flat paper, but on a surface of a sphere? What would happen? All they did is simply change the shape of that paper. Right? And that resulted in something called non-Euclidean geometry. It completely changed the world. Okay? A completely new way of doing mathematics, but completely new way of doing many things, including art. This inspired all of Escher's work. Right? Now, I just want to burst your bubble a little bit while I'm here. Euclidean geometry tells you that the sum of all the interior angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. That's just false. Everything you learned in school is wrong. We'll come back to that next time. It's partially true, I should just say that. So here's another thing. You take a triangle, right? You arrange the triangle with certain patterns in a particular way, and you color them. Right? If you color them, if you choose your coloring scheme a certain way, you get patterns. Is this mathematics or is this art? If you color it differently, you get different patterns. Now, these are called fractal patterns. Everybody's heard of fractals. Fractals are not just mathematical objects, they're artistic objects. Right? They show up in finance, they show up in the human body, they show up everywhere. The shape of a cloud is fractal. A paint splash is fractal. Right? Jackson Pollock's work is all fractal. So, these are the kind of topics we talk about in our course. My colleague and I have sort of taken charge of a course called Contemporary Mathematics for Everyone. It's a Gen Ed, formerly Gen Ed math course. And so we try to make connections between abstract ideas in mathematics and art and music, biomechanics. We actually collaborated with a juggling team that came up, visited campus last year. And we did a little performance with them. So mathematics is really everything. It's everywhere, right? And it's the connections that set the stage for creativity. That's sort of the main takeaway message, I would say. Of course, breadth, I'm pushing for breadth. I'm pushing for connections. But at the same time, I do think breadth is necessary, right? To sort of span the spectrum of creativity that Pablo was talking about. Right? The greater the content, the richer the stuff you can create. I'll stop here. I think I hit 8. Thank you.
So just Neil's gonna come up now and kind of talk about everything that we've just discussed. Just a few more books that he's written, all right, just to kind of set the stage. Neil is the critically acclaimed author of biographies of William Carlos Williams, Man Ray, as I talked about, Thomas Edison, as he mentioned, and Henry Ford, as well as 2 other pieces, The American Revelation and The Legends of the Plumed Serpent, biography of a Mexican god. He's also currently under contract, writing a book called Martha Graham, When Dance Became Modern. So, Neil.
So, we really want to hear from you. So, you see how obsessed everyone was with their 8 minutes. That Pablo and I dreamed this up, but I'm going to bring this in about, I would say, 4. So what I did was, I'm the respondent, by the way. So what I did was, as everyone was speaking, I decided to pick the keywords of each person's presentation because, as you could tell, even if you just think about the books that I've written and the book that I'm writing now, the terrain that was covered by these people is very pertinent to what I do, but it's a different way of language, a different language. So Pablo, to me, the main takeaway concept for me was utilitarianism, because the first book I wrote on William Carlos Williams, who, as you may know, was a poet from New Jersey, actually, and he actually wrote an essay which made a big impression on me, called What is the Use of Poetry? Utilitarianism is, I feel, something that is not relevant to me as a creative writer. And I've thought about this a lot over the last several decades of producing literature, because I think, and this will show the connectivity between what the people were talking about and what I was thinking about while they were speaking, is that once you become, for instance, I had an artist friend who I used to visit his studio occasionally to see what he was doing, and I knew he was going through a bad period when he said that I came to his studio one day and he had a show coming up in about a month. And he said, I really have to produce a lot of work in the next 20 days because I have a show coming up. And he was sitting there staring at blank canvases because his fixation on utilitarianism was blocking him. The second thing that I wanted to just mention in terms of what Pablo spoke about was his work with the museums. I was speaking to Ashwin before the symposium about how the last conversation I had with Pablo, it was an aesthetic conversation about going to a museum, but his insistence was that the way he looked at a painting was very, very different from the way that I looked at a painting. And I accepted that. But we were still both dwelling in the realm of a given, that is the appreciation of the artwork. So over the years that I've come to be speaking with him, I have realized this sort of, for me, not coming from a quantifying background, being able to see, especially I think you would agree with me now, that it can be just as creative, if not more so. Josh's piece really resonated with me because the leaving kids alone element, it's interesting because I've also, in the past 7 years, I've been lucky. I have 4 grandchildren now that I didn't have 7 years ago. And so I've spent a lot of time babysitting them, and actually spending most of my time leaving them alone is what I found was the right way to treat them. And that has affected my teaching at the university as well, because I feel like if a student is going to progress in terms of knowing, of coming to know a subject, then for me, the inductive method is the best. The inductive method, and the fact that I pride myself on the fact that I go through a whole class without making one declarative statement, ever. Everything is inquisitive. Everything is from a questioning standpoint. And I let them figure it out. So my job has become to be the instigator. Baptiste, the idea that standard measures, I hope I get this right. Forgive me if standard measures are not possible in terms of quantifying creativity and the difficulty of establishing criteria for these tasks. There is not a unitary construct. This came up today in our college meeting. We had a meeting in this room of all the faculty of the College of the Arts, where I teach in theater and dance, and we had the different departments here, and our dean made an announcement about a rubric that was coming to us from the administration, having to do with what is called SSHs, which is just another way of saying student semester hours, which is another way of quantifying how one is productive as a professor. And I'm not going to go into that, obviously. I'm not going to go into that now for you, but I will say this, that I believe that Baptiste is touching a nerve when he talks about what he talked about, because by the same token, when I teach a seminar of 15 people, I would say that 25% of the experience of that seminar is the affect. I mean, maybe even more than 25%. I'm just in a kind of quantifying mood because of all these talks we just listened to. But I mean, affect to me supersedes subject. And I think that is going to be a constant. It is a problem now in the academy, but to me it's not. It's a problem from an external point of view of quantification. Quantification of affect is, to me, is a contradiction in terms. Julie, I forgot that her subject was narratology because that makes perfect sense. Because Julie, who I've known since I first came here to the university, her devotion to the progress of learning and the fact that her vocabulary is so centered on the journey of learning in the classroom context toward an objective, toward something that one is to aim for, to me is a very exemplary manifestation of what creativity is in a pedagogical setting. So the class becomes a kind of narrative, and one is telling the story while one is in the story as a character in the story. That's what we do when things are working well. I will also address her reference to feedback because this happened to me just last week. I teach a seminar for dance students on writing about dance. They're performers, and we write about what they do. And okay, so I asked them I wrote the word critique on the whiteboard. I came in and wrote the word critique with my marker. They did not like that word. They weren't sure what I meant. They took a negative point of view on it. They said to them, critique means criticizing, and it's not a positive thing. I said, well, what would you prefer? And they said feedback. They said this is their word. I mean, this is really their word. Critique, which to me is like, that's sort of my holy grail. You know, that's my background in literature, and that's what you're supposed to do, step back and objectify the work of art and all these kinds of modernist things that I was trained in. I mean, I've had to disabuse myself of a lot of that, and I think that feedback has helped me do that, accepting that feedback is what the students need. So Ashwin, who I've also known for a long time, we've had lots of conversations about the nonlinearity, the irony of nonlinearity being the ideal that one strives for in terms of how to learn best. And we recently published a paper by Ashwin at the Creative Research Center on this concept of the connectivity of networks in terms of how better to approach subject matter, which I believe should not be so proprietary. But teaching in a university, it's very hard to espouse that point of view. To believe that subject matter does not belong to anyone is a very difficult point of view to maintain. But I think that Ashwin's sort of structural analysis is what shows that is much better. Again, to end with my mentor, William Carlos Williams, he wrote another essay which was called "When Rhyme Fails, Structure Comes to the Rescue." And I think that what Ashwin is saying in terms of his ending up with the Lego concept of education, which I think would be a fantastic way to start a whole new university, because when you look at Legos, some of them come with the instruction book, but the point of really having fun with Legos, which I've also learned in my last 7 years, is that you must discard the instruction book and make your own structure by just dumping the whole box out on the floor and seeing how to fit them together yourself. And that's my response. And now we should get to the talking.
I was actually wondering, how do you cultivate creativity in the 100 plus college classroom. In other words, am I responsible for being creative in the sort of performative nature of what it means to be in front of 100 people? Yes, but also how do you, since there isn't that opportunity for one-on-one, a lot of what you guys were talking about was smaller context, more one-on-one interaction, being able to respond to people's squares or circles or whatever. How do you, with no direct feedback, get them to be creative or know if they have?
Jill.
I'll address the first part of your question about teaching to large classrooms. I'm not sure I understand the second part of your question, but the first part I think is the same for when you teach small classrooms. So you present a problem to students. You give them some tools to respond to the problem, right? You, like I said in my presentation, you allow them to struggle with a problem together in small groups in a large classroom. There's lots of models online. You don't have to reinvent anything. If you really want to say, how can I engage a large classroom, get them working on a problem, using each other as knowledge bases, but also putting something together to present as, evidence of what they've learned and how they went about learning what they learned, it's very doable in a large classroom. It really begins with the problem and setting up that inquiry-based environment and saying, okay, this is what we're going to tackle, and I'm maybe going to break you up into small little teams where you're going to tackle this problem, right? And here's how you're going to tackle it, and here are the roles each of you are going to play in those teams. And this is what I expect for you to produce at the end of this activity or this assignment, whatever it may be. It takes work, I'm not going to lie. It's labor on the part of the instructor.
You're going back to the idea of small groups. So on some fundamental level,
yeah,
it's not possible in large.
An engaging lecture can be just as effective as small group work in a large classroom too. Again, this is not anything I'm inventing, it's all out there. The labor is in the preparation of those sorts of activities and exercises and assessments within the classroom. So structuring it ahead of time so that if you are doing a lecture, for example, your lecture is chunked up into knowledge, into bite-sized bits that students can take, absorb, grapple with, process, compare with each other, and then you're breaking that large lecture up into manageable chunks for students that are chunks of knowledge, things they should know, that isn't just a knowledge dump, it's just not an information dump onto them. That does take work, it takes some time to set that up and prep for those sort of classes, but it is doable. And there's a lot of good models. I would point you to Michael Sandel. He does a great job with his justice studies class at Harvard. There's videos online. Go and look at them and be inspired. See in your own small manageable ways what you could use for yourself. The second part of your question, though, I don't remember what it was, but I know that I couldn't quite answer it. So.
I was just curious about what you teach. Visual culture.
Maybe I can add something here.
Yeah.
Maybe in bigger settings like that, you could also explain to people what is creativity and that they have the potential to be creative. So that we realize more and more that explaining to people what is creativity can help them be more creative. Because if you convince that you're not creative because it's just for Picasso and Da Vinci. Chances are you're not going to be creative indeed. So if you explain what it is and that people have agency on that and have the potential to be creative, that might be a start. And that you can do that with 2 people in front of you or a whole lecture hall.
Just to add to that as well, even just telling somebody to be creative, it's called the be creative effect. There's research on this, is enough to kind of give people the momentum to think outside the box or try something new. But I think what we don't tend to do a lot, especially at the higher education level, is to kind of allow that to happen and tell people that that's okay, and that's probably something I'm looking for as an instructor. And one other sort of strategy is to give people choice. And that's something that I do in my classes. I have some of my students here, and I'll assign a project or a term project, but they get to choose what topic and what area they would like to focus on. And I think it's been effective in them kind of opening up, right? Because that's what they know. So that's like their area of expertise, and motivation is also very high. And if motivation is high, you're more likely to be creative than if somebody says, research this, right? As opposed to, what would you like to research, right? Of course, you need to set up the constraints, a little bit of it, give some parameters as well that they have to sort of stay within. But at the same time, that openness and that motivation and that interest does boost creativity and experimentation and making mistakes and failing.
I try to use students' questions, their own questions, as much as possible. I'll ask them questions, but I also, at the beginning of the semester, I ask each student what the one question they would like answered in this course is. And then when I give lectures, I often put a slide with that student's question on it, and I find that that makes particularly that particular student pays attention. But they also, so if you're a student in my 100, I have almost nearly 100 people in my social psychology class. Every once in a while, you'll see a student just sort of go, whoa, there's my question. And so I think 90% of good teaching is asking the right questions. And I notice that when I get guests in, I look at their behavior, and if they just start supplying information to the student, I know they're going to lose them. It's like, why do you assume I would want to know I didn't ask you to give me the 6 different definitions of this thing. So if I start with their question, I find that then they start getting encouraged to ask more questions in class. And I think partly that is whether that induces creativity in them or not. It certainly opens, it allows them to feel safe about bringing forth questions that represent creativity or curiosity.
This question may make the student semester hour people cringe. How do you folks feel online and hybrid classes are affecting our ability to foster creativity in the classroom?
I think it's just the way, if I can start, same thing as face-to-face teaching is how it's structured. I actually teach a course online called Creativity, Imagination, and Critical Thinking. So it's been pretty well received. Yeah, I never know fully, right? You're always like, I wonder if it's working. But I think it's working. One of the things that we do is I use the discussion, sort of post-discussion thread format a lot. What I've learned, I've taught this course, I think 3 times already, 2 or 3 times, is that the discussions sometimes are richer than it is face-to-face. One, I guess one of the reasons is that students are often hesitant to speak in front of others. And when they're on that kind of, not anonymous, people know their names, but it's kind of anonymous at the same time, right? People don't see them. They can take their time. They can think about it. In their own time and in their own space, they can talk about what they want to talk about. Right, exactly. And so that comes out. And I could see it, but it takes time. It takes about a few sort of weeks for them to get into that mode. And I think one of the strategies is to not critique too much, but give feedback as far as that's a great response to this other student's post because, and as Julie mentioned, because it really enriched that discussion in this way. So given that pointed feedback, I do realize that it's actually more work for me to sit there, wait for them to come, right? Like sometimes I'm sitting there like, it's gonna come now. It's due time is 11:59 p.m. Sometimes I'm actually up. I can't sleep. Like, okay, I can comment on that. Right, okay, I'll save the rest for tomorrow. But it's a lot of work versus in a 2.5-hour lecture, right, where you can respond immediately and you're constrained. So even the instructor himself or herself is actually not constrained as far as time to give feedback.
Just to segue from what Pablo said, I guess a few years ago, again, I was sort of late to the party, if you will, but so I was asked, people would write a paper and print it out and bring it to class and hand it to me, and I would collect them. And I was, very into that kind of way of doing things, which was, everyone was coming late because they had just they finally got to the printing place, and they were out of breath. And anyway, to make a long story short, so they started, like most of us do, submitting electronically. But so I decided to, instead of going through each paper line by line, like line editing them, I wrote, again, this takes more work, but it worked out much better. I wrote emails to them. Like, I would read the paper and I would write their name, dear, whatever. I just finished the paper and this is what I think. And I would sort of be very, not stream of consciousness, but very informal and tell them what I liked and what I thought needed improvement, et cetera, just sort of like writing them a letter. And the response to this way of communicating with them was very positive. I mean, they were very sort of touched by the idea. I'm just telling you, this to me was, I was doing my job as a professor by responding to them. To them, it was a sort of extraordinary that I would take the time to write to them. And I'm just bringing that up. I'm not saying it to self-aggrandize, but it definitely.
I would be happy to expand on that. So teacher, establishing your presence as an instructor in an online class is very important. You don't need to be available 24/7, of course.
11:59 stops.
But like Pablo noted, you have the benefit of time in online courses, and students have more time to reflect and absorb knowledge and decide what they're going to do with it in an online course, which is great. It's something you don't get in a face-to-face classroom because students are expected to answer questions like that, and oftentimes they can, right? That's why we have silent classrooms, right? We throw a question out there, it's a good question, and nobody raises their hand, and you can stare students down and they still will not. They'll avoid your eyes, they'll be busy with their whatever. But in an online classroom, they get that time to think, and they can respond, and it's in a written form, so it's a whole different mode. So there is that value of writing and creating your own presence, being there, answering, moving them along. And then the other thing I would like to suggest is that the ability to set up a really valuable self-reflection in online courses, which you should also do in face-to-face, is good because that is another step in the online course where students reflect on what they've done, and that reinforces the learning that you've established through your course design.
So something this reminded me of it. So I taught a face-to-face course, an upper-level physics course last year, and I was very impressed with myself. Some days when you have a good lecture, you're so happy coming out, and the students are nodding, they're agreeing with you, they're smiling, they're asking questions. Of course, when I gave the final exam, I would say 25% failed. So I was obviously doing something wrong. And then I had the chance to teach an online course over the winter break. And it went much better than I expected. The engagement was better, the response was better. The outcome, I do have a problem with online courses. I don't think it works for every case, for every course. There are certain things that I miss out on. I miss seeing the excitement of the students. They miss seeing my excitement for the subject. I want to do some things with them, working with them, watching them do it, them watching me do it. Those things are lost. I guess, yeah. Mm-hmm. So
I don't like it. I'm just going to say that. I think the anonymity, in my experience, fostered deep, like the students said nasty things to each other. And as a teacher, you realize how much information you get from people's nonverbals in a classroom. Yeah. You can see when they're not understanding. It's like smearing cold cream over your vision of all that when it's online. So like I have a little computer screen and I have it's like the Brady Bunch. I've got 15 people in my class in a little box. And then on top of that, they can write each other notes from the thing, from the portal, and I will see the notes, and so it'll be like everything you hate about a class where people are passing notes to each other, but it's built in. It's supposed to be a feature, but it's driving you nuts.
A virtual spitball.
And so what I found was, I mean, obviously, you would need to compare the same students and the same configuration in a live class. But my sense was always that I was like an air traffic controller in a set of machinery that I didn't know, and I was trying to keep these students from destroying each other by crashing into each other. And that disturbed me a lot, to think that they were paying so much money for what felt like a two-dimensional experience that magnified all the worst things about the online environment where people can be nasty to each other. I didn't think it was great for learning.
Go.
Just so glad. Is this working?
Yes. It is. That's
working.
We can hear you.
When I was in 6th grade, I had a teacher named Mr. Botbile. And I loved being in school, but I didn't love learning in school. I usually got distracted with other things. And I started asking questions. And he wrote on my report card, "It is a delight to have Socrates in class." And it changed my life. And I was thinking as I was listening and making my connections, my little Lego connections among all of you, that teaching itself is a form of extraordinary creativity. It engages human beings as your medium, as you create an environment of transformation, which is what art is all about. And so the teacher is a model of creativity. The creativity of the teacher is probably the most powerful element in that classroom. And I was also thinking that learning, which is inquiry, learning is inquiry, that's all it is like falling in love. And my mother taught me when I was very young, learning is the most exciting thing you'll ever do. It's play, it's everything imaginable, all wrapped up into learning. And the thing I wanted to say, I wrote an essay years ago as I was involved. I was a teacher, I'm a professional sculptor and writer, and I spent 10 years supporting education through the Geraldine Dodge Foundation. So I had the privilege of going to Harvard and Yale and elsewhere to look at cutting edge ideas in education, including Howard Gardner and Stephen Keller and all of these wonderful people. And what I was realizing was when you describe standing in front of a work of art and feeling small, that emotional experience. I wrote an essay years ago, and my first line was, "When the child sits on the edge of the seat, learning takes place." And emotion means motion. That's what the word means, something that sets me in motion. If I'm angry or I'm sad or whatever, it drives me in some way that an idea may not. So I was thinking that grades are cold. They're cold. Feedback later on is cold. It doesn't have the emotional presence. And that what all of you are talking about is so vibrant and so exciting because it has all the elements of how to make learning a process of falling in love. We don't want to be told we're loved 3 days later when we're in love. We want to hear it right now. We want to know, oh, I'm on track here. I'm getting somewhere. And it's the most exciting thing in the world to make discovery. So forgive me for going on, but you've just inspired me so much.
Keep gushing.
And my,
Lovely.
my question, if I have a question, is your comments on art.
I'd actually
had
like
your
to
8 minutes.
respond to what you said. I didn't get a chance because I was a little flustered by the time constraint. But all feedback isn't good. So your point about learning being in motion is very important, and that feedback be timely is also very important. But there are some studies, and I think it was Kluger, and it's on my reference list if anyone's interested, that found that when looking at forms of feedback that students receive, over a third of feedback is negative feedback, and it actually shuts students down. So we should be very careful about what we consider feedback and what feedback is intended to do, which is move students toward a goal, right? So that goal should be well defined, and students should know what you expect. And even if it is experimental and they're taking risks and they're going to be wrong, it still is honoring ideas and honoring the work. So I didn't get a chance to say it, but it was on there, and feedback should be task-oriented. It should not be ego-oriented, right? So it's very important for us to know that when we talk about feedback and its value in education and learning, that we know that feedback should be good feedback. I just wanted to add that because you made me think of that I didn't say that, but it's important to know. Yeah. Thank you for that. That was very lovely. Thanks a lot.
This lady right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'd like to ask if we encourage creativity in daily educational practice, will that be a little bit cause some inefficiency or in accomplishment in our teaching content? Or should we adjust our teaching content to the creativity? So sometimes in my teaching practice, it is a little bit like a paradox. So I have a lot to teach, and I'd like to encourage their creativity. So how to coordinate the two? So thank you.
Great question, but just to know, this is Dr. Yanwei Wang. She's a visitor from Jilin Jiangsu University in China. So welcome. Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Well, we've had this conversation when we were designing the creative thinking course. Several of our faculty members struggled with the same thing. Should we cover stuff first? Like, students need to know some things before they can decide what to throw away, that we don't need that, right, in order to be creative. So there is this it is a paradox or a conundrum for faculty, like, how much do we teach? Where do we allow the space for creativity to happen when we have to cover all this stuff, right? They still have to achieve this grade and move on to the next one and maybe graduate school or whatever. So there are practical concerns that students have and that we have in covering content and allowing space for creativity. That is not an answer to your question. I don't have an answer to your question. I just wanted to say we've struggled with the same question about what to cover, how much students should know before they have enough in their toolbox to be creative.
So this is a problem that we also, I teach Calculus 1, Calculus 2, there's a whole sequence of courses, a physics first course, second course, and so on. You're required to know certain content in one of these courses before you move on. Now, the trouble is there's a problem with the term coverage, right? Just to cover for the sake of coverage, just because the textbook has a certain material, that is not, I'm not sure the students are learning. I'm enjoying myself talking about all the things I know. And the students just see my back if that's the case. But when I look at the students, sometimes I realize they haven't gotten a single idea across. I haven't gotten anything across to them. It's my duty to stop. It's my duty to see what they've learned, right? It doesn't matter. If they know how to learn, they will figure out the rest of it. If they enjoy learning, they will continue learning. The rest of it is immaterial. I think we've just made a game out of it. It's not a game.
There's a lady in the back.
This is just this is just a question for Pablo. Talking about the defining components of creativity, you mentioned newness, and then you gave a list of terms or concepts that are, maybe intended to flesh out what newness means. And I just sort of wanted to invite you to say more about, because glancing at that list, some of them seem to pull apart a little bit or seem to point in different directions. And I just wonder if you can say more about the newness component in defining creativity, maybe others too.
Yeah, I think it's just the newness part of it is that's what folks kind of agree on, that if you, in order to judge creativity, let's put it this way, in order to judge it, it's hard to call it something creative if it's the old stuff, all right? But, and I know that makes no sense, I'm gonna it doesn't have to be a completely new entity. It could be a new combination of old entities, right? So that's one of the things about creativity, is that if you take two things that are kind of known and you combine them, that's new, that's novel, that could be groundbreaking. You can also take something and split it apart. Instead of having that one kind of old thing, which is nothing wrong with old things, but you can split it into multiple components that, because they're split and taken apart from the original, they could be seen as new.
But I guess some things that are split won't count as new, and some things that are combined won't count as new. And so I guess this is where context comes in.
They have to be recognized within that context. Yeah. So you sort of have to have that experience and an immersion and engagement with whatever particular context it is, to be able to kind of realize that it is. Right. I mean, you can't say something is new unless you know what's been there in the past. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I could add to that. What's important is what's new for the person who's creating something. So you can be reinventing the wheel. It's new for you, and that makes it creative as well. And that resonates well with the 4C model of creativity. So there's this sort of a micro level of creativity that, you know, when a child invents things that, you know, it's not going to be groundbreaking or change the humanity, but these are creative acts on their own sake, because, you know, it's new for the child himself or herself.
I remember my 2-year-old when I was playing with her and teaching her to add, and I might have told you the story before, Tiger. I asked her to do 5 plus 6, and she would count on her fingers, and she came to the end and said, and then she picked out her foot. I was so proud. That was a proud moment for me as a dad. And that's genuinely creative, I believe. Right.
Well, the other...
She's discovered a new use for her foot.
Thank you for the question.
Is this on? Oh, yes, it is. Okay. Just to start off, I'd like to say that I love the idea of a non-linear style of education, where it's almost this Lego model of taking a linear course and then adding general requirements to it to make it unique. And as an undergraduate student, I wanted to ask, because I think the popular idea among students is that you have to stay on track with your major and take the courses in the correct order, you know, big quotes, correct order. And I think a lot of students look at gen ed courses almost as distractions from their major. And personally, I don't see them as distractions. But I wonder, and this is for anyone on the panel, how would you go about taking gen ed requirements for students and advertising them as something that's more beneficial to them? And I know sometimes they do that by almost making it more specific, like for instance, the psychology of education class. That's almost saying, oh, if you're not interested in psych, will this benefit you as a teacher? Do you think gen ed should be more geared towards a certain goal, or should students just accept the fact that sometimes a gen ed isn't exactly going to fit perfectly with their career? I'm curious to what anyone on the panel would say to that.
General education courses. So at Montclair State, the first 2 years of coursework for undergraduates is usually gen ed courses, requirements that are intended to give students a liberal exposure to across the disciplines, right? So a liberal exposure to many different disciplines, and they all add value to increasing knowledge and breadth of knowledge. I think it's a wonderful question. I love this question.
Thank you.
I do, because the gen ed question, I really think, do any faculty here want to answer the gen ed question? It's a big question. It's hard to answer, but yes, in general, we should be showing the relevancy to students why they are taking general education courses.
I'll just say it's the difference between knowledge and technique, right? Technique is what you get when you're taking just your major courses. When you're taking all of these other courses, this is when you're acquiring knowledge.
So I think we're out of time.
Nope, one more.
One more?
Sorry.
We got last one. And then we're going to hang around after as well. So just in case.
I actually had a question I wrote down, and it goes like, how do we educate ourselves better on creativity and its power? And even more important, how do we engage others in this world of free, into this world of free imagination? And I wrote, I know a lot of people are aware that being creative is something natural, something that lives among us. But how do we embrace that or engage more afraid individuals to join this concept of creativity? Because I believe having more people believe in this art can really do like amazing things for us. And it kind of like becomes sort of a personal driven curiosity for me, because I know that there's like more people like me. And then, you know, like I just want to search and, you know, find these people that believe in creativity and that are willing to somehow reach out to me and, you know, just, yeah.
I think you're here, so this is a good start.
This
right?
is a good
like,
start.
Like-minded people. What's your major?
Music therapy.
I think you know what you could do is meet with folks individually, like Neil and the panel members here on campus. We also do a lot of work, not just scientific work and creativity, but we're in touch with institutions and organizations that promote creativity, creative thinking, and all those other things. So I think that's a good first step, right?
Yes,
to just reach out to folks.
Thank you.
So are you looking to form communities in person, or are you interested in virtual communities as well? I mean, I would say go online, go to social media. You know this better than I do probably, right? How do folks meet up these days? Do they meet each other online? Form clubs, go to the student center, Center for Student Involvement. Those sorts of things, take the initiative. If it doesn't exist, make it exist, right? That's also part of being creative. So go form those groups. Eventually, others will come to you, right? Once you gave them a space to make that happen. So if it's not there, make that space is my advice.
Form a student group, and we'd be happy to serve as advisors.
Absolutely. My name, yep.
Yep.
Find me. I'd be happy to help.
I will.
Yeah, the Creative Research Center has a virtual student center page. You should visit us.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.